Robert Martinez had always been a quiet man who preferred the sound of running water to the noise of neighbors. When he purchased the 40-acre property in Pine Valley Estates back in 1987, it came with something most homeowners only dream of: his own natural spring and a small dam that had been built by the previous owner in the 1960s. The crystal-clear water bubbled up from deep underground, creating a peaceful stream that wound its way through his land before flowing into the community below. The property deed was crystal clear about his water rights. Robert owned the spring, the dam, and had every legal right to control the water flow on his land. The original developer had even included special provisions in the deed acknowledging these rights when the community was first planned. Robert had paid extra for this unique feature, knowing that owning water rights in their drought-prone region of California was like owning liquid gold. For the first 15 years, life was perfect. Robert built a modest home overlooking the spring, planted fruit trees, and created a small garden that thrived thanks to his natural water source. The gentle sound of water flowing over the dam became his daily meditation. His neighbors below benefited too, as the consistent water flow kept their small decorative ponds full and their property values high. Everyone seemed happy with the arrangement. The trouble began in 2002 when Pine Valley Estates decided to incorporate as an official homeowners association. Robert had been grandfathered in when he purchased his property, meaning he technically wasn't required to join the HOA. His deed predated their formation by 15 years, and his water rights were completely independent of any community agreement. However, the new HOA board had different ideas about how things should work in their neighborhood. At first, the HOA simply sent friendly letters asking Robert to attend their monthly meetings. They claimed they wanted to coordinate community, water management, and ensure everyone was working together for the common good. Robert politely declined, explaining that his water rights were private and legally protected. He had no obligation to join their association or submit to their authority over his own land. The letters became less friendly over time. The HOA board began questioning whether Robert's dam was aesthetically appropriate for their community standards. They sent him copies of architectural guidelines that had been created years after he built his home, suggesting he needed to modify his property to match their vision. Robert calmly responded with copies of his deed and water rights documentation, making it clear that he had no intention of changing anything on his legally protected land. Margaret Whitfield, the HOA president, was a retired corporate executive who ran the neighborhood association like her former boardroom. She had moved to Pine Valley Estates specifically for its pristine community standards and wasn't about to let one holdout property owner undermine her vision. Margaret began attending county planning meetings, researching zoning laws, and looking for any possible way to force Robert into compliance with HOA rules. The situation escalated when the HOA hired a lawyer to review Robert's water rights. Their attorney found that while Robert's ownership was legally sound, there might be environmental regulations they could use to challenge his dam. In 2003, they filed a complaint with the county claiming that Robert's dam posed potential flood risks to downstream properties and violated modern environmental standards. Robert was forced to hire his own attorney and spend thousands of dollars defending rights that were clearly documented in his deed. The legal battle dragged on for months, with the county eventually ruling that Robert's dam was grandfathered under existing permits and posed no environmental threat. The HOA's complaint was dismissed, but the experience left Robert feeling frustrated and violated. Margaret wasn't finished. If legal challenges wouldn't work, she decided to try social pressure. The HOA began organizing community events that pointedly excluded Robert, even though some activities were held in areas that bordered his property. They circulated newsletters that included subtle references to certain property owners who weren't team players and didn't contribute to community improvements. Some of Robert's neighbors began treating him coldly, influenced by whispered campaigns about how he was being selfish with community resources. A few longtime neighbors remained friendly, but many newer residents who had bought into Margaret's vision of a perfectly controlled community saw Robert as a problem that needed to be solved. The final straw came in early 2004 when the HOA sent Robert an official demand letter requiring him to submit his property to their architectural review committee and pay retroactive HOA fees dating back to 2002. They claimed that his water feature required community approval and that he owed thousands of dollars in back dues and fines for non-compliance. Robert's attorney reviewed the demand and confirmed what Robert already knew. The HOA had no legal authority over his property whatsoever. His deed was ironclad, his water rights were unquestionable, and he owed them nothing. But Margaret and her board seemed determined to make his life miserable until he either joined their association or sold his property and moved away. As Robert sat by his spring that evening, listening to the peaceful sound of water flowing over his dam, he realized that the HOA's harassment campaign was just beginning. They had shown they were willing to waste thousands of dollars on frivolous legal challenges and turn neighbors against him through gossip and social pressure. Margaret Whitfield had made it clear that she wouldn't stop until she had complete control over every property in Pine Valley Estates. What the HOA didn't understand was that Robert Martinez wasn't just a quiet man who loved the sound of running water. He was also a retired civil engineer who understood exactly how water systems worked, what his legal rights were, and what would happen if he decided to exercise those rights fully. They were about to learn that sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous when pushed too far. The dam that provided water to their decorative ponds and kept their property values high existed entirely at Robert's discretion. If the HOA wanted to treat him like an enemy, he was prepared to remind them exactly who controlled the water they all depended on. Margaret Whitfield's campaign against Robert Martinez intensified through the spring of 2004. She had convinced herself that allowing one property owner to remain independent would set a dangerous precedent that could unravel everything she had worked to build in Pine Valley Estates. Her vision was simple: a perfectly controlled community where every property looked identical, every lawn was exactly the same shade of green, and every resident followed the same rules without question. Robert's property was the only thing standing in the way of that vision. His modest home, natural landscaping, and obvious independence made him a target that Margaret couldn't ignore. She began holding special HOA meetings focused specifically on what she called the water rights issue, inviting legal experts and environmental consultants to speak about the supposed dangers of private dams and unregulated water features. These meetings were carefully orchestrated theater designed to build community support for further action against Robert. Margaret would stand before slideshows showing examples of dam failures from around the country, completely ignoring the fact that Robert's small dam was nothing like the massive structures in her fear-mongering presentations. She talked about property values, community standards, and the importance of everyone working together for the common good. The newer residents bought into Margaret's presentations completely. They had moved to Pine Valley Estates expecting a certain lifestyle, and Margaret's warnings about property values dropping made them genuinely fearful. Many of these homeowners had stretched financially to afford homes in what they believed was an exclusive, well-managed community. The idea that one neighbor could potentially impact their investment was terrifying. However, some longtime residents who remembered the community before the HOA began asking uncomfortable questions. Tom Bradley, who had lived in Pine Valley Estates since the early 1990s, stood up during one meeting to remind everyone that Robert's water had been flowing into their ponds for decades without any problems. He pointed out that their property values had actually increased since Robert built his dam, not decreased. Margaret quickly shut down such dissent by suggesting that past performance didn't guarantee future safety. She brought in a consultant who claimed that climate change and increased development in the region meant that previously safe water features could now pose significant risks. The consultant recommended that all private water features in the community should be brought under HOA oversight to ensure proper maintenance and safety standards. Robert learned about these meetings from Tom Bradley, one of the few neighbors, who remained friendly despite the growing social pressure. Tom warned Robert that Margaret seemed to be building toward something bigger than just harassment letters and social exclusion. The HOA was clearly preparing for another legal challenge, but this time they were being much more strategic about building community support first. The next escalation came in the form of a formal petition that Margaret began circulating throughout the neighborhood. The petition called on the county to conduct a comprehensive safety review of Robert's dam and water rights, claiming that concerned residents had identified potential flood risks that threatened the entire community. Margaret collected over 60 signatures from homeowners who had been convinced by her presentations that Robert's dam was a ticking time bomb. When the petition was filed with the county planning department, Robert received another official notice requiring him to appear at a public hearing. This time, however, the county seemed to be taking the complaints more seriously. The planning department announced that they would be conducting their own independent review of the dam's safety and environmental impact, which could potentially result in requirements for expensive modifications or even removal. Robert's attorney warned him that while his water rights were legally protected, the county did have the authority to impose safety requirements on any structure that could potentially impact other properties. If the county determined that the dam needed expensive upgrades or modifications, Robert could be facing tens of thousands of dollars in costs, even though his dam had been operating safely for over 40 years. The county's review process would take months, during which time Robert would be in legal limbo. He couldn't make any modifications to his dam without county approval, but the HOA was already claiming that the mere existence of the review process proved their concerns were legitimate. Margaret used the pending review as evidence in her next wave of community meetings, suggesting that county involvement proved Robert's dam was indeed dangerous. Meanwhile, the social pressure on Robert continued to increase. Someone began leaving anonymous notes in his mailbox calling him selfish and demanding that he do the right thing for the community. His garbage cans were occasionally knocked over, and he noticed that cars would slow down as they passed his property, with passengers staring at his dam as if it were some kind of dangerous eyesore. The harassment reached a new level when someone called the county's code enforcement department to report that Robert was running an illegal water business on his property. The complaint claimed that he was selling water to commercial customers and operating without proper permits. While completely false, the accusation triggered another investigation that required Robert to spend time and money proving that he was simply using his own water on his own land. Robert began to realize that Margaret and the HOA were using a strategy of constant harassment designed to exhaust his resources and patience. They couldn't win a direct legal challenge against his water rights, so they were trying to make owning those rights so expensive and stressful that he would eventually give up and either join the HOA or sell his property. The strategy might have worked on someone else, but Robert Martinez had spent his entire career solving complex engineering problems. He began documenting every instance of harassment, every false complaint, and every legal challenge. His attorney advised him that the HOA's behavior was beginning to cross the line into targeted harassment that might be legally actionable. More importantly, Robert began studying exactly how the water from his spring flowed through the community. As a retired civil engineer, he had always understood the basic mechanics of his water system. But now he began mapping out precisely which properties received water from his dam and how much they depended on that flow for their decorative features and landscaping. What he discovered was fascinating and potentially very powerful. The HOA had spent so much time arguing that they should have control over his water that they had never stopped to consider what would happen if that water simply wasn't there. Nearly 30 properties in Pine Valley Estates received some water flow from Robert's spring, either directly through the stream or indirectly through groundwater recharge that kept their wells producing. The decorative ponds that Margaret was so proud of, the lush landscaping that kept property values high, and even some of the community's irrigation systems all depended on the steady flow of water that Robert's dam helped regulate. If he chose to exercise his legal rights differently, the entire character of Pine Valley Estates could change overnight. As Robert sat by his spring that evening, watching the water flow peacefully over his dam toward the community below, he began to formulate a plan. Margaret Whitfield wanted to play hardball and use every legal and social weapon she could find to force him into submission. It was time to remind her and the entire HOA exactly who held the real power in this situation. By the summer of 2004, Robert Martinez had reached his breaking point. The county's safety review of his dam had dragged on for 6 months, costing him thousands of dollars in engineering reports and legal fees, only to conclude what he had Known all along, his dam was perfectly safe and posed no threat to anyone. The county's final report actually commended the original construction and noted that the dam provided beneficial flood control for downstream properties. Margaret Whitfield was furious when the county's report was released. She had been telling everyone who would listen that Robert's dam was dangerous, and now an official government review had not only cleared the structure, but praised its design. Rather than accept defeat, Margaret doubled down on her campaign, claiming that the county's review wasn't thorough enough and demanding that the state environmental agency conduct their own investigation. Robert's attorney delivered the news about Margaret's latest legal maneuver on a particularly hot Tuesday morning. As Robert listened to the details of another potential year-long legal battle, complete with more fees, more paperwork, and more stress, he realized that Margaret would never stop. She had made destroying his independence her personal mission, regardless of the cost to herself, the HOA, or the community. That afternoon, Robert walked his property with a new perspective. Instead of seeing his land as a peaceful retreat that he needed to defend, he began thinking like the engineer he had been for 30 years. Every water system could be controlled, redirected, or shut off. Every flow pattern could be modified. Every dependent user downstream was vulnerable to changes in their water supply. Robert pulled out his old surveying equipment and began creating detailed maps of exactly where his water went after leaving his property. He traced the stream bed, measured flow rates, and calculated volumes. What he discovered was even more significant than he had initially realized. During the dry summer months, his spring provided nearly 60% of the water that flowed through the community's decorative features. The implications were staggering. The beautiful ponds that were featured in the HOA's marketing materials, the lush gardens that kept property values high, and the small waterfalls that created the peaceful ambiance Margaret was so proud of all depended heavily on water from Robert's spring. Without that steady flow, Pine Valley Estates would look very different, especially during drought periods when municipal water was restricted. Robert also discovered something else interesting in his research. When the original developer had planned Pine Valley Estates in the 1980s, they had specifically designed the community's water features around the natural flow from Robert's spring. The engineering plans, which Robert obtained from the county archives, showed that the developer had counted on Robert's water to maintain their decorative systems year-round. This meant that every homeowner in Pine Valley Estates had bought their property based on landscaping and water features that were only possible because of Robert's generosity in allowing his water to flow freely through their community. They had all benefited from his spring for years without ever acknowledging that benefit or showing any gratitude. Robert began researching his legal options with renewed energy. His attorney confirmed what he had suspected. As the owner of the water rights, Robert had every legal authority to modify how his water was used on his own property. He could redirect the flow, store more water for his own use, or even completely stop the downstream flow if he chose to do so. The legal principle was simple and well established in water law. Robert owned the spring and had senior water rights that predated every other property in Pine Valley Estates. Just as he couldn't be forced to join the HOA, he couldn't be forced to provide water benefits to people who were actively trying to destroy his legal rights and peace of mind. Robert's attorney also pointed out that the HOA's behavior over the past 2 years could potentially constitute harassment and intentional interference with his property rights. They had filed multiple frivolous complaints, spread false information about his property, and created a hostile environment designed to force him to abandon his legal rights. Such behavior might not only be ethically wrong but could also be legally actionable. However, Robert wasn't interested in another lengthy legal battle. He had already spent too much time and money defending rights that should never have been questioned. Instead, he began developing a more direct approach that would demonstrate exactly how much the community depended on his goodwill. The plan was elegantly simple. Robert would exercise his legal rights as a property owner to modify his water usage in ways that would immediately impact the downstream community. He wouldn't destroy or damage anything, but he would stop providing free water benefits to people who had shown him nothing but hostility and legal harassment. Robert spent several weeks planning the technical details. He would need to install additional storage capacity on his property to capture more of his spring water for his own use. He would redirect some of the flow to expand his own gardens and create new water features that would be entirely contained within his property boundaries. Most significantly, he would install a valve system that would give him complete control over how much water, if any, flowed downstream to the HOA community. The modifications would be entirely legal and would actually improve his property value by creating better water storage and more attractive landscaping. Robert would finally be able to use his own water resources for his own benefit, rather than subsidizing the lifestyle of neighbors who had treated him as an enemy. Robert also realized that his plan would serve as a powerful educational tool. For 2 years, Margaret and the HOA had acted as if they had some kind of authority over his property and water rights. They had never acknowledged that their own prosperity depended on his generosity, and they had never shown any appreciation for the benefits he had provided to their community. By temporarily stopping that flow of benefits, Robert would demonstrate exactly what Pine Valley Estates would look like without his contribution. The empty ponds, brown landscaping, and dried-up water features would provide a clear lesson about the real relationship between Robert's property and the rest of the community. The timing would be perfect. Summer was the driest time of year, when municipal water restrictions were strictest, and the community's dependence on his spring was most obvious. If Robert implemented his water modification project during peak summer heat, the impact would be immediate and undeniable. Margaret Whitfield wanted to control his water rights so badly that she was willing to spend thousands of HOA dollars on legal harassment. Robert decided it was time to show her and the entire community what it would actually look like if she got what she claimed to want: complete control over water usage in Pine Valley Estates. The irony was delicious. The HOA had spent 2 years arguing that Robert's water should be subject to their oversight and control. Now they were about to learn what would happen if Robert decided to exercise the complete control that he had always legally possessed. The first phase of Robert's plan began in early September 2004. He had spent the late summer months quietly obtaining all the necessary permits for what he described to county officials as property improvements and water conservation measures. Every modification he planned to make was completely legal and actually aligned with the county's drought management goals. Robert hired a local excavation company to begin work on his expanded water storage system. The workers arrived early on, a Monday morning, and began digging a series of retention ponds on the upper portion of his property, near the natural spring. To his neighbors, it looked like Robert was simply doing some landscaping work, which wasn't unusual for someone who had always maintained his property meticulously. Margaret Whitfield noticed the construction activity immediately. From her home office window, she could see the excavators working on Robert's land, and she assumed he was finally making the modifications that the HOA had been demanding. She was pleased, thinking that their pressure campaign had finally forced Robert to improve his property to meet community standards. What Margaret didn't realize was that Robert's improvements were designed to achieve exactly the opposite of what she wanted. Instead of integrating his water system with community oversight, Robert was creating complete independence from any downstream obligations. The new retention ponds would allow him to capture and store much more of his spring water for his own use, rather than letting it flow freely to the community below. The construction took 3 weeks to complete. Robert worked closely with the contractors to ensure that every detail was executed perfectly. The new ponds were lined with high-quality materials that would prevent any leakage, and they were sized to hold several weeks' worth of spring flow during normal conditions. Most importantly, they included a sophisticated valve system that would give Robert complete control over water release rates. While the construction was happening, Robert also began phase 2 of his plan: comprehensive documentation. He set up several digital cameras around his property to record water levels, flow rates, and the current condition of the community's water features. He wanted a complete record of how things looked before he made any changes to his water management. Robert spent several days walking through Pine Valley Estates with his camera, photographing every pond, fountain, and water feature that benefited from his spring. The community really was beautiful, he had to admit. The landscaping was lush and well-maintained. The decorative ponds were full of clear water, and the small waterfalls created a peaceful atmosphere throughout the neighborhood. It was ironic that Margaret and the HOA had spent so much energy trying to control the very resource that made their community so attractive. They had taken Robert's water contribution for granted for so long that they seemed to have forgotten it existed. Now they were about to be reminded of its importance in the most direct way possible. Robert also began documenting the HOA's ongoing harassment campaign. Even while he was making improvements to his property, the legal attacks continued. Margaret had filed another complaint with the state environmental agency, claiming that Robert's construction work was potentially damaging to local groundwater. The complaint was completely baseless since Robert had obtained all proper permits and was working entirely within his own property boundaries, but it still required time and money to respond to. The state investigation, like all the previous ones, found no violations or problems with Robert's work. However, the pattern was clear. Margaret intended to keep filing complaints and legal challenges indefinitely, regardless of their merit. She was trying to make Robert's life so miserable and expensive that he would eventually give up and surrender his water rights to HOA control. By early October, Robert's new water storage system was complete and operational. The retention ponds were full of crystal-clear spring water, and the valve system was working perfectly. Robert could now control exactly how much water flowed downstream to the community, from full flow to complete shutoff. With simple adjustments to his valve settings, Robert decided to test his system with a gradual reduction rather than an immediate shutoff. He wanted to see how quickly the community would notice changes in their water supply and how they would respond. On a warm Tuesday morning in mid-October, Robert adjusted his valves to reduce the downstream flow by about 30%. The effect was subtle but noticeable. The decorative ponds in the community began dropping slightly, and some of the smaller fountains started showing reduced flow rates. The community's automatic irrigation systems, which had always relied on a combination of municipal water and natural flow from Robert's stream, began drawing more heavily on the municipal supply. Within a week, several homeowners began asking questions about why their water features seemed to be running lower than usual. Margaret initially dismissed their concerns, suggesting that it was just normal seasonal variation, or perhaps related to ongoing drought conditions in the region. She had no idea that Robert was beginning to exercise greater control over his own water resources. Robert continued his gradual reduction over the next 2 weeks, decreasing the downstream flow by another 20%. Now the changes were becoming more obvious. Several decorative ponds were noticeably lower, some of the smaller water features had stopped working altogether, and the community's landscaping was beginning to show signs of stress despite the homeowners' efforts to compensate with additional municipal water. The first complaints to the HOA came from homeowners whose expensive landscaping was beginning to suffer. They had invested thousands of dollars in plants and garden designs that depended on consistent water availability, and the reduced flow was causing visible problems. Several homeowners called Margaret directly, demanding to know what was happening to their water supply. Margaret was baffled. She knew that the community's water came from a combination of municipal supplies and natural sources, but she had never bothered to understand the details of how the system worked. In her mind, the HOA controlled everything important in Pine Valley Estates, so any water problem should be something she could fix with a phone call to the appropriate authorities. When Margaret called the municipal water department, they confirmed that there had been no changes to the community's water service. The city was providing the same amount of water as always, so any shortages must be coming from other sources. That's when Margaret began to suspect that Robert's recent construction work might be connected to the water problems. Margaret organized an emergency HOA meeting for the first week of November. She announced that the community was experiencing water supply issues and that they needed to investigate the cause immediately. She didn't directly accuse Robert of causing the problems, but she made pointed references to recent construction activities and private water features that might be affecting the community's resources. About 40 homeowners attended the emergency meeting, many of them visibly upset about the condition of their landscaping and water features. Margaret had prepared another presentation with photographs showing the current state of various community amenities, comparing them to how they had looked earlier in the year, The difference was stark and undeniable. Robert did not attend the meeting, but Tom Bradley did. Tom listened to Margaret's presentation and the complaints from other homeowners with growing understanding of what was really happening. After the meeting, Tom walked over to Robert's property and found him sitting peacefully by his new retention ponds, which were full of clear, flowing water. Robert smiled when he saw his old neighbor approaching. Tom looked at the beautiful new water features on Robert's property and then back toward the community, where the decorative ponds were obviously struggling. The connection was finally becoming clear to someone besides Robert. Tom Bradley stood at the edge of Robert's property, staring at the beautiful new retention ponds filled with crystal clear water, while the decorative features in Pine Valley Estates below were obviously struggling. The realization of what was happening hit him like a physical blow. After 2 years of watching Margaret Whitfield wage war against Robert Martinez, Tom finally understood the true power dynamic in their community. "Robert," Tom said quietly, "this is your water, isn't it? All of it. Everything in the community that makes it beautiful comes from your spring." Robert nodded calmly. "It always has, Tom. For over 15 years, my spring has been providing water to your ponds, your fountains, and your landscaping. I never asked for anything in return. I was happy to share." Tom looked back toward the community, where homeowners were struggling to keep their expensive landscaping alive despite paying hundreds of dollars in additional municipal water costs. "Does Margaret know?" "Margaret knows whatever she chooses to know," Robert replied. "She's had access to the same county records and engineering plans that I have. She just never bothered to research where your community's water actually comes from. She was too busy trying to control something she never understood." The conversation between Tom and Robert that evening marked the beginning of a shift in Pine Valley Estates. Tom had been one of the original residents and remembered how the community had developed. He recalled that the developer had specifically marketed the water features as one of the community's main attractions, but he had never questioned where the water came from to maintain them year-round. Tom began doing his own research, starting with the original sales materials from when he had purchased his home in 1991. The marketing brochures specifically mentioned natural water features fed by mountain springs as one of Pine Valley Estates' unique selling points. The developer had built the entire community's identity around water amenities that were completely dependent on Robert's generosity. Meanwhile, Margaret was struggling to explain to increasingly angry homeowners why their water situation was getting worse instead of better. She had promised quick solutions at the emergency meeting, but every agency she contacted told her the same thing. There were no problems with municipal water service, no infrastructure failures, and no environmental issues that would explain the reduced flow to community water features. By mid-November, the situation in Pine Valley Estates was becoming desperate. Several homeowners had lost thousands of dollars worth of landscaping despite spending enormous amounts on additional municipal water. The decorative ponds that had once been the community's pride were now muddy, algae-covered eyesores. Property values were beginning to suffer as potential buyers noticed the obvious water problems. Margaret finally decided to confront Robert directly. She marched up to his property on a cold Thursday morning, accompanied by 2 other HOA board members, demanding to know what he had done to the community's water supply. She found Robert working peacefully in his garden, using water from his own spring to maintain the most beautiful landscaping anyone in Pine Valley Estates had ever seen. "What have you done to our water?" Margaret demanded, gesturing toward the community below where several homeowners were visible trying to save their dying gardens with expensive municipal water. "I haven't done anything to your water," Robert replied calmly. "You don't have any water, you never did. What you had was my generosity, and I've decided to redirect my resources toward my own property." Margaret was speechless for a moment as the full implications of Robert's statement sank in. "You can't do this. This is community water. You're destroying property values for everyone." Robert pulled out a folder of legal documents that he had prepared for this exact conversation. "Margaret, this is my spring, on my land, protected by my water rights that predate your community by decades. I've been sharing my water with you for 15 years without asking for anything in return. But since you've spent the last 2 years trying to sue me, harass me, and steal my legal rights, I've decided to use my water for my own benefit instead." The HOA board members who had come with Margaret began to understand what was happening. They looked at Robert's thriving gardens and full retention ponds, then back at their community where homeowners were facing thousands of dollars in water bills and dead landscaping. The contrast was stark and undeniable. "You're holding the entire community hostage," Margaret shouted. "This is extortion." "This is property ownership," Robert replied firmly. "For 2 years you've told me that I should be subject to HOA control, that my water should be managed by your committee, and that my rights don't matter. Now you're experiencing what Pine Valley Estates looks like when I actually exercise the control you claim I shouldn't have." Robert handed Margaret a copy of his water rights documentation, the original engineering plans for the community, and a detailed analysis of how much water he had been providing to Pine Valley Estates for free over the past 15 years. "Your developer built this entire community around my water, marketed it as a selling point, and never bothered to secure any legal rights to it. Every homeowner here has been benefiting from my generosity without ever acknowledging it." Margaret stared at the documents, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of her mistake. She had spent 2 years and thousands of HOA dollars attacking the very person who had made their community possible. Every legal challenge, every harassment, campaign, and every attempt to force Robert into submission had been directed at the source of Pine Valley Estate's most valuable asset. "What do you want?" Margaret asked quietly, her earlier anger replaced by the dawning realization that she had no legal leverage whatsoever. "I want to be left alone," Robert said simply. "I want to use my own property as I see fit, without interference, from people who don't own it and have no legal authority over it. I want to stop receiving frivolous complaints, harassment letters, and threats from neighbors who have been benefiting from my generosity for years, without ever saying thank you." Margaret looked around at Robert's beautiful property, then back at the struggling community below. Several homeowners were visible in their yards, standing over dead plants and empty fountains, looking defeated by water bills they couldn't afford and problems they couldn't solve. "If we stop the complaints, if we leave you alone, will you restore the water?" Margaret asked. Robert considered the question carefully. "Margaret, for 15 years I shared my water freely because I thought we were all neighbors who respected each other. You've spent 2 years proving that respect doesn't exist. Why would I continue providing free benefits to people who have shown me nothing but hostility?" The answer hung in the air between them like a challenge. Margaret had spent so much energy trying to control Robert that she had never considered what would happen if she succeeded in driving him away or making him too angry to cooperate. Now she was finding out. As Margaret and her board members walked back toward the community, they passed several homeowners who were staring up at Robert's property with new understanding. Word was beginning to spread about the real source of their water problems, and people were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about how the HOA had handled the situation with their most important neighbor. The transformation of Pine Valley Estates over the following weeks was swift and dramatic. As word spread about Robert's water rights and the HOA's role in creating the crisis, the community began to fracture along lines that had been building for months. Some homeowners were furious with Margaret for attacking the very person who had made their lifestyle possible, while others remained convinced that Robert was somehow the villain for exercising his legal rights. Tom Bradley emerged as an unexpected leader among the residents who wanted to find a peaceful solution. He organized informal meetings at his home where homeowners could discuss the situation without Margaret's inflammatory rhetoric. These gatherings revealed just how much the community had been kept in the dark about their water dependency and Robert's generous contributions over the years. During one particularly heated meeting in Tom's living room, resident after resident shared stories of how much money they had spent trying to save their landscaping. The Johnsons had paid over $3,000 in additional water bills in just 2 months. The Patel family had lost their entire backyard garden, which had taken them 5 years to establish. The Stevensons were considering selling their home because they couldn't afford to maintain the property they had purchased specifically for its beautiful water features. As these stories emerged, a clear picture began forming of just how much financial damage Margaret's campaign against Robert had caused. The community was facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in collective losses, all because their HOA president had decided to wage war against the person who had been subsidizing their lifestyle for free. Meanwhile, Margaret was facing a full-scale revolt within the HOA board itself. 3 of the 5 board members called for an emergency executive session to discuss her leadership. They had finally obtained copies of the legal documents Robert had shown Margaret, and they were shocked to discover that every complaint she had filed against Robert had been completely without merit. Board member Janet Reeves was particularly angry when she learned that Margaret had been spending HOA funds on legal challenges that had no chance of success. "You've wasted over $20,000 of our money attacking someone who was providing free benefits to our entire community," Janet said during the heated board meeting. "Worse than that, you've created an enemy out of our most valuable neighbor." The board voted 4-1 to remove Margaret from her position as president, with only Margaret voting to retain herself. They immediately began drafting a formal apology to Robert and exploring options for repairing the relationship that Margaret had so thoroughly destroyed. However, the damage went far deeper than anyone initially realized. Robert had been documenting every instance of harassment, every false complaint, and every legal challenge for over 2 years. His attorney had advised him that the HOA's behavior constituted a clear pattern of targeted harassment that might be legally actionable. Robert was now considering whether to file his own lawsuit against the HOA for the stress, legal fees, and damage to his peaceful enjoyment of his property. The new HOA board found themselves in an impossible position. They needed Robert's water to restore their community, but they had no legal leverage to demand it. Robert had every right to use his own water for his own purposes, and after 2 years of attacks, he had no reason to trust that any agreement with the HOA would be honored. In December 2004, the new board sent a formal delegation to Robert's property. Board President Janet Reeves came accompanied by Tom Bradley and 2 other longtime residents who had opposed Margaret's campaign from the beginning. They found Robert working on expanding his gardens, using his spring water to create the most beautiful landscaping in the entire region. "Mr. Martinez," Janet began carefully, "we want to formally apologize for everything that has happened over the past 2 years. Margaret's actions were not representative of the entire community, and we deeply regret the harassment you've endured." Robert listened politely but said nothing. He had heard promises and apologies before, usually followed by new demands and legal threats. "We understand that you have no obligation to provide water to our community," Janet continued. "We also understand that our property values and quality of life have been dependent on your generosity for many years. We're here to ask if there's any way we can rebuild the relationship that Margaret destroyed." Robert considered their request carefully. "What are you proposing?" Tom stepped forward. "We want to offer you something that should have been offered years ago. Formal recognition and compensation for the water you've been providing. We're prepared to negotiate a legal agreement that would acknowledge your water rights, provide you with reasonable payment for the water you share, and guarantee that you'll never face HOA interference with your property again." The proposal was interesting, but Robert had learned to be cautious. And what happens if a future HOA board decides they don't like our agreement? What happens if someone like Margaret gets elected president again in a few years? Janet pulled out a thick, legal document that the new board had been working on with their attorney. "We're proposing a permanent easement agreement that would be recorded with the county and binding on all future property owners. The agreement would be part of every deed in Pine Valley Estates, making it impossible for any future HOA to challenge your rights or interfere with your property." Robert reviewed the proposed agreement over the following weeks with his own attorney. The terms were more generous than he had expected. The HOA was offering to pay him a monthly fee for water usage, cover all of his legal costs from the past 2 years, and create a permanent legal framework that would prevent any future harassment. More importantly, the agreement included provisions that would allow Robert to modify or terminate the water sharing arrangement if the HOA ever violated the terms of their deal. Robert would retain complete control over his water rights while receiving fair compensation for the benefits he provided to the community. On a sunny morning in February 2005, Robert Martinez stood by his retention ponds and slowly opened the valves that would restore water flow to Pine Valley Estates. Within hours, the decorative ponds began refilling, the fountains started flowing again, and the community's landscaping began its recovery from months of drought-like conditions. The signed agreement between Robert and the new HOA board became a model for water rights negotiations throughout the region. Legal experts praised it as a fair resolution that protected individual property rights while ensuring community stability. Most importantly for Robert, it guaranteed that he would never again face harassment for exercising his legal rights on his own land. Margaret Whitfield quietly sold her home in Pine Valley Estates 6 months later and moved to a different community where she hoped to find the perfectly controlled environment she had always wanted. Her departure was celebrated by most of her former neighbors, who had finally learned the difference between community leadership and authoritarian control. Robert continued to live peacefully by his spring, sharing his water with neighbors who had finally learned to appreciate both his generosity and his rights. The sound of water flowing over his dam remained his daily meditation, but now it also served as a reminder that sometimes the quiet ones hold the most power when pushed too far.